Hey everyone, so for our project, we're analyzing football transfers. So just a quick overview of our agenda. We're going to introduce the data set, then introduce the questions that drove our analysis, and then we'll get into the takeaways and some future analysis that we want to do. So our data set consists of transfers from 6 European football leagues from 2019 through 2021. So those are the past 3 seasons. Each transfer has all these attributes listed here, and a quick snapshot of the CSV file is pictured here. So a little bit more on those attributes. The transfer period refers to either summer or winter when transfers can take place. The leagues are highlighted here. There's 6 of them from across Europe, and the years are also listed here. And just we wanted to look at the years before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID.
So a little more how transfer windows work. So transfer windows are periods where clubs are allowed to sell or buy players so they can transfer from one club to another. And how do they do this? So they purchase the rights to a player so they can join their club. So a club, for example, pays 10 million euros to another club for the rights to one of their players. And if they agree on a fee, then that player is allowed to go to the purchasing club. And this market is usually worth billions of euros in just transfer fees. So there are different types of transfers. We have the traditional free agency. When a player's contract with the club runs out, they're free to go to whichever club they like as long as they get an offer. We have the direct transfers, which is the one I mentioned about a club paying another club a fee, which they negotiate. And if they agree on it, then the player is allowed to transfer to the club that's purchasing. There's also transfers with variables, meaning that, let's say a club pays 50 million for a player, but can pay up to 10 more million based on like performance. There's also loans, which is just player joins the club for a year or 2 and then comes back to their parent club with no fees attached. These are called dry loans. We also have loans with fees, so you pay $1 million to loan a player for 2 or 1 year. We have loans with an option or obligation to buy. So by the end of the loan, the club who is getting the player has the option or obligation to buy the player. And they usually do this to delay transfer fees so they don't pay straight away. And we also have loans with variables that can make the option into an obligation based on player performance. So now that we have that done, let's talk about assumptions. So dry loans are counted as transfers with no fees in the data set. So for every loan that we had, it's going to appear as a 0 on the transfer fee variable. Loans with option or obligation are marked as a 0 for the year they were made. And for the year the option is exercised, they count as a transfer. So let's say there's a loan from 2019 to 2020. So in the 2019 data set, it appears as a 0 transfer fee. And let's say that there's an obligation in 2020 for 30 million. So in 2020, it's going to be a 30 million transfer fee. And also the other assumption we made is that the variables are counted as a total transfer fee. So let's say a player fee is 50 million with 15 in variables. So it's going to appear as a 65 million transfer in the data set.
So on this slide, we're going to talk about our motivating questions. And the first one that we wanted to know was whether COVID has made a difference in transfer patterns. Going off of that, we wanted to know whether there are differences between the summer period and the winter period. And then we wanted to kind of get more information on the transfers themselves. So we wanted to know if spending more money actually leads to club success. So for that, we compared data to the historically successful clubs. We also wanted to know what types of players are most likely to be transferred. And so we looked at specific attributes for that. And then lastly, we just wanted to know very broadly, do different leagues have different transfer patterns? So starting with COVID, we wanted to know if there are differences between the past 3 seasons, again, which were before, during, and after COVID. And what you can see here is that the average fee of all transfers has significantly dropped from 2019. So we can probably say that clubs' willingness to pay has decreased a little bit. And moving forward, we also wanted to look at what types of players are most frequently traded. So you can see them circled here. They're center back, central midfield, and center forward. And basically those positions are the most essential positions in the game. So you can expect that these would be the most commonly transferred. We also looked at the age of players who are transferred, and you can clearly see that younger players are most often transferred, and after about 21 years, the number of transfers per age just decreases very steeply. Going back to the question about the transfer periods. So are there differences between summer and winter? This bar chart clearly shows that yes, there are far fewer winter transfers in each year than in summer. And this makes sense because the winter period is much shorter and there's just less turnover of players. Addressing that last question, do transfer patterns differ by league? You can see here that for the most part, leagues have the similar number of transfers, but Serie A and Liga NOS definitely stick out as having the highest number of transfers. And Liga NOS specifically is actually known for having selling clubs. So that would make a lot of sense why they have more transfers.
So we also want to see how much they're spending on average. And we can see that the Premier League spends almost as double as Ligue 1 and Liga NOS. And this was to be expected given they have a very lucrative broadcasting deal. And we also see that Serie A and Liga NOS, which had the higher transfer volumes, are significantly less than Premier League. And we can assume from this that most of their transfers are either loans or loans with options. So we want to see how the biggest fees paid for during each period differed. And we can see that 9 out of the 15 biggest transfer fees were made before the pandemic. And the ones who were made during the pandemic are 3 of the 5th lowest fees paid. We can see that the transfer fee in 2021 rose up to the previous levels, even though the volume isn't still there.
So here we looked at whether successful clubs traditionally spend more money. And what you can see here is that Manchester City, Chelsea, and Real Madrid all have average fees that are greater than 25 million. And these clubs historically have been very successful. You can also see that the top spending club in each league, on average, they spend 18 million euros, which is 2 times more than the average across all clubs.
We also have to see how they performed during the 3 years based on their spending. These are the 10 biggest spenders across all 6 leagues, and only 3 of them are represented here. So we can see that clubs like Arsenal spend hundreds of millions of euros, of pounds, and they didn't get any success from them. Whereas we had clubs like Real Madrid who spent a lot in the first one and didn't spend at all in the second next 2, and they done really well. And we have clubs like Man City, which spend consistently similar amounts, and they also saw a lot of success. We also want to see how much the most valuable clubs in the world perform, as they're the biggest. They usually have the biggest fan bases and the biggest global brands and purchasing power. So we can see that clubs like Bayern Munich, Paris Saint-Germain, and Liverpool, which are within this 15, didn't spend at all compared to their rivals, and they all won their respective leagues, which was a really good takeaway. And we also see that the average spending all 3 years decreased during the pandemic, and it hasn't risen up to 2020 before pandemic levels in 2021. And now we want to see how much they sold compared to how much they purchased. We can see that also the sales aren't quite to before pandemic levels. We also see them decrease almost each year. And we can see that they weren't forced into selling, so the selling didn't increase during the pandemic. And they, even through all of this, they're still operating with negative transfer cash flows, meaning that they purchased players more than they sold them. And we can see that some clubs like Inter Milan and Real Madrid were sold significantly more during the pandemic than before for different reasons. So some things we can do to improve this data set in the future. We would like to reevaluate with the winter 2022 transfer window, which was this January, and the future one, which is going to be between June and August of this year. We would also like to expand the data set by including higher selling leagues like the Deutsche Divisa, Brazilian Serie A, and the Argentinian Primera División, to see how their selling clubs performed and how their impact of the pandemic impacted the European buying clubs. And we would also like to update the data set to differ between the variable fee and the direct transfer fee. So the transfer fee isn't as inflated due to the inclusion of the variable fee, which is not always met. So we could get more precise numbers. Thank you.